Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'll be attempting to discuss the ergonomic advantages over the Colt versus the Smith and Wesson. A lot of people have no idea because Colt's been kind of like, missing in action, so to speak, for quite a long time, even though they sell quite a few guns still, just not as many. So to start out, I have the official police from the 1950s. This is a C-frame Colt. This was before the D-frame, which ended up being the Colt Agent, the Cobra, the Diamondback, and they just chopped the grip butt down, but they kept the same thing going on here in terms of ergonomics, internals and what have you. And then what I have over here is Smith & Wesson. It's a model 64-6 in stainless, of course. It's a popular gun, but there are some major differences between Colt and Smith & Wesson. Colt coming before Smith & Wesson. So what's the big deal, right? They're both good revolvers. The major difference between the two is the ergonomics and how it functions. When you pick this guy up, it has a tendency to point straight right at the get-go, and your hand goes really high in the sinus. The butt being big on the bottom, narrow on the top, it forces your hand up, and your hand doesn't float all over the back strap. It stays put the same time every time. The trigger is sickle shaped, and it is narrow. Trying to get a good pick here for you guys. There we go. It is narrow compared to the Smith and Wesson. That is wide. Now, being sickle shaped, and you get your finger in there, your finger rides the same way every time when you cycle the gun. And being narrow like that, it allows the trigger to glide across the inside of your finger and find, a spot in your inside knuckle where it likes to hang out. So your concentration is not on the trigger, because your hand's so high up on the grip, it just becomes like second nature to squeeze that trigger. Whereas if you have a wide trigger like this and you try to squeeze this guy here, you've got a lot more meat there. And the way that this Packmeyer grip is on this Smith & Wesson, it puts the trigger right in to my digit knuckle pit, right where it needs to be for my hand size. So if it were not for this grip on this Smith & Wesson, it would be kind of like you'd have to kind of learn the trigger, learn where to touch it, the way your finger moves across it after you learn the hold. On the Smith & Wesson, the Colt. The Colt, you do not have to learn the grip, and you do not have to learn a trigger. It's second nature. You don't even think about it. When you pick this guy up, your hand's high, your finger's in the right spot every time. You don't even have to learn to hold this thing. It sort of trains you along the way, so it fits one way. And the way the hammer spur is on this, you might notice how everything is really easy to get to, you know, with just one hand. I'm going to adjust my grip a little bit because I don't have my snap caps in just yet. And this has got a firing pin on the hammer, which makes it a little bit more problematic. If you drop that on a empty, you can end up breaking that firing pin off. So ergonomics are there on the Colt. You can tell the way that, you know, the way it knuckles in on your thumb and trails back to the way you pull the trigger. You don't have to adjust your grip much ordinarily. And when you want to eject it, pulling this guy back, you can do it with very little grip adjustment. And then you could bump your plunger to eject, or you could flip it with your hand and eject. You know, you can operate this gun with one hand entirely, except for loading in your bullets, of course. But let me get this guy closed. There we go. The Smith & Wesson, on the other hand, when you try to operate this with one hand, it's a little bit more cumbersome. You know, with one hand. It can be done, but you got a lot more bulk going on there. And typically a Smith & Wesson is much heavier. Both of these are unloaded. But before we can get to weighing these things, I want to show you the way that the hammer spur interacts with the hand. That's quite painful. You know, the way that your thumb interacts with this guy here. It's not to my liking. On the Colt, it rolls right into your thumb quite well. You know, so that's not even an issue on the Colt. But that's another ergonomic feature that's lacking on a lot of Smith & Wessons. But the weight ratio to, like, the cylinder weight puts the gun kind of like a forward dip, if you will, in your hand. And on the Smith & Wesson, there's a lot of grossness ordinarily with the grip on these, because they're very top heavy compared to the little frame Colts. By little frame, you can tell this frame is significantly smaller than this frame. There's less weight, obviously. And I believe the barrel on the Colt is a little bit longer. You know, I think this one might have been, or might be 5 inches. This guy's a 4-inch barrel. The cop revolvers used to have 5-inch barrels standard, and then they changed it to a 4. Don't really know why, but you know, Smith & Wessons tend to have heavy barrels, and Colts tend to have a lot lighter barrels until you get into their custom stuff out there. And this is a pencil barrel. It's meant for law enforcement, no frills. This is somewhat of a bull barrel, if you will. It's heavier. It just adds weight. So the longer you're holding this thing, the more tiresome it's going to get in your hand, and the more gross your handling is going to be under duress. But some people like a heavy-nosed gun, you know, because they think that helps with accuracy. It just helps with the recoil, but it doesn't do anything for accuracy at all. All right, so let's try this guy on the scale. Let's see how much these these guys weigh. Alright, so I got a scale here. I'll zero it. Oh, there we go. It's getting a little hard to see here, the lighting. See if I move this where you can actually see what it says. There we go. Okay, we're still at zeros. This is the Colt. Official police. So we're looking at 1 pound, 9 ounces, unloaded. So now we're going to try the Smith & Wesson. £2 pounds, 5 ounces, and then some. You can tell that the Smith & Wesson is significantly heavier compared to the Colt. Both of these guns are, I don't know in terms of R for the Colt if it's still in use, but they're law enforcement type guns that would be used in the profession. Personally, I'd like to have the Colt. It's easier to shoot. I don't have to focus on my trigger, don't have to focus on my hold. It's easy on the thumb when I cock the hammer. I can get around that frame real easy. Smith & Wesson, on the other hand, that to me is going to be like a boat anchor. If you got to carry that thing around all day, it's going to be quite tiresome. And when you get ready to draw that sucker out, you know, timing is going to be an issue with that heavy gun. Whereas being lighter, you can score hits faster. It's just going to be more painful, being that the trigger ring, you know, is probably going to batter the middle finger, being a lighter gun, and you're higher in the sinus area. Not so much on the Smith & Wesson, but that's also probably because of the grip, you know, the Pachmayr grip. So I'm going to remove these grip, well, this grip, to show you why the Smith & Wesson, the grip is not so easy to figure out on this guy, because they tend to have a high to mid hold on the grip strap, you know, and you have to consciously do that when you shoot these things, because if your hand slips and slides all along the back and you're just trying to find the sweet spot so that you can handle the gun, your trigger pull is going to vary compared to where your finger is applying pressure on the trigger hook, or if you like, a trigger shoe. It just depends on who you are, whatever. But trigger shoe, trigger hook, same thing. But on the Colt, on the other hand, you really don't have to think about the grip or the trigger. But on Smith & Wesson, you have two different springs that come into play with your trigger pull. Your trigger pull is usually focused in this area right here. There's a little strut that pushes this sliding rectangle back, the sliding block. If you look at the wet trail behind it, you can tell the way it moves. It moves back. So there's a spring in there. When you pull the trigger, you got direct spring pressure right there in this black box. And then you have another spring that also comes into play. You've got the hammer spring, this guy right here. And there's a screw there that you can tighten it up or loosen it. Get a different type of pull if you like. And so when you pull the trigger on this sucker, you've got two springs working together, you know, at different points of the pull of the trigger. So you're pulling this guy back, you got direct resistance of this coil spring inside the sliding block, this black block right here. Trigger goes up on our radius, it hits this other black piece right here, the double action sear, and it attempts to lift the hammer up. But when that happens, you encounter the hammer spring. So you got like a compound trigger pull now. When you're pulling this guy, I'm trying not to load the parts too much, but so you got direct pressure on the trigger, and then it hits the double action sear. It lifts the hammer, and you can see the leaf spring, that's the hammer spring, come into play. You got two springs. They have two different types of load. You can adjust the load here with this screw, and the way that you adjust the one in here is you buy a different spring, the different load weight, and those are kind of those are not easy to get in. I've gotten a few in time and time again, but I'd rather not. Okay, so I have a Colt here, and it's already taken apart. So what makes this go is this V spring. You see right here. It does two jobs. It resets the trigger, and it also becomes the hammer spring. So when this gun functions, the spring is dynamic two different ways, and it's just one part instead of two. It's just one spring. Because of that, and also being a leaf spring, it tends to be lazy on the reset. With Smith & Wesson, having a coil spring dedicated to the trigger allows faster cycle time, which makes the gun, way better for competition, where seconds count. Having that spring sliding block that goes straight back, and you pull the trigger on a Smith & Wesson, the pressure of your trigger is usually right about here. Like that's the focal point of the stress of your finger when it pulls. It also makes the gun cycle top heavy. Where, once again, this gun weighs more than the official police from 1950. And being top heavy and having, without this Packmeyer grip, having to figure out where you have to hold the back, where you have to figure out to hold the trigger, when you're shooting this thing, trying to find a sweet spot, it's not going to be the most accurate thing right at the get-go, unless you really train it into your muscle memory. Which makes the Colt a far ergonomically superior design, because your first shot will probably be accurate right at the get-go and thoughtless. Your follow-up shot might take a little bit longer, but it's going to be equally as thoughtless. That requires minimal skill sets. This guy here requires a lot of skill sets, like trigger control, muscle memory, hand placement, and then being extra hefty on top. It just, to me, it's very gross and sloppy without this Packmeyer gripper grip. And I just totally love this grip when it comes to Smith & Wessons, because it forces my grip in the one spot, and it forces my trigger finger in the right spot every time, even though it feels weird because it's got this big wide trigger hook, paddle, shoe, whatever you want to call it. Actually, they call it these hammer spurs or paddles. Different names, different times for different people. But hope you can understand the ergonomic advantages of a Colt having only one spring, power both trigger and hammer, and the way that these guys, just give me a sec. These are snap caps. Safety first. But you need to use these in guns that have a firing pin on the hammer, so you don't break the pin off. If the pin breaks off on this gun, it's going to have to go to a shop to be custom made, because I don't think they sell those parts anymore. Alright, so we got our snap caps in. So having one spring, when you shoot this guy, having one spring, it's just Right now I'm feeling the pressure before the hammer drops. You know, it just builds. But it's just like pulling back a bow. It's right about here. And then it increases. And then the hammer comes down. So the pressure is not constant on the trigger. It's just, move my hand down for illustrative purposes. It draws like a bow right about here, and increases. And then right now it's really tight. And then it lets it go. But usually at that point, when you're all the way back here, your hand's all the way up on the sinus way back here, you know, so when it gets ready to go, it's kind of like everything's aligned, and you know, that's the best spot for it, because that's where you can concentrate on where your front sight is. You know, on the Smith & Wesson, the minute you start drawing on that trigger, you've got pressure to deal with up until it breaks. But the Smith & Wesson, it's like constant, like when you pull on it all the way to the end. And then you hear some clicking noises from the other parts that interact with the trigger pull function. You don't hear nearly as much in the Colt. That's not a big deal, but the purpose of this video was to demonstrate why the Colt design was more ergonomic than the Smith & Wesson. You know, and I think I've proved that point, and I hope you can understand, you know, the placement of the trigger spring, the placement of the hand, and then how it interacts with the trigger, and the way that this thing was made versus the way that this was made. This is very chunky for a revolver. I'm sure if you end up getting a J-frame, it'd be a lot easier. But all right, anyway, that's an awful lot to cover. But don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll send more detail out there. And let me know in the comments how you feel about it. Hopefully I can answer some questions. And catch you the next time.